This wasn't supposed to be discovered. A hidden engine trick, worth up to 100 extra horsepower in the final meters of a lap, used by top teams, completely legal and invisible to everyone watching. Until one team did something no one expected. They didn't copy it. They didn't expose it publicly. They asked a single question, and that question forced the FIA to act immediately. What they found changed the championship, because this wasn't just a clever idea. It was a loophole that could decide pole positions, races, even titles. And now it's gone. But here's the part no one is talking about. The team that triggered the investigation might be the one that benefits the most. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this decision could completely reshape Formula One. At first, nobody said anything. Because in Formula One, the most dangerous advantages are the ones that look normal. And this one looked completely normal. Cars going flat out on a qualifying lap. Drivers pushing to the absolute limit. Everything exactly as expected, until you focus on the final seconds. The last straight. The moment where every lap is decided. That's where a few engineers started to notice something uncomfortable. Not a glitch, not a mistake, a pattern. Because while most cars began to lose a fraction of speed near the line, others didn't. They stayed stable, calm, almost too perfect. And that tiny difference was enough to change positions on the grid. But here's what made it truly unsettling. There was no visible reason, no obvious boost, no illegal deployment, nothing that would trigger an investigation, at least not immediately. And that's exactly why it worked. Because this wasn't about adding power. It was about removing a limitation. A limitation every other team was still dealing with. Now, to understand how big that is, you need to think like an engineer. Every car on the grid follows the same fundamental behavior when energy runs low. The battery drains. The hybrid system starts to pull energy back, and the car slows down slightly. It's not dramatic, but it's always there. Every lap, every circuit, every driver, except now it wasn't. And that's where the real question begins. What if someone found a way to avoid that slowdown completely? Not by breaking the rules, but by using them better than anyone else. Because deep inside the regulations, there was a condition, a safety rule, one that forces the system to reduce power smoothly, to protect drivers, to avoid sudden speed differences. But hidden next to it was something else, a penalty that only matters if it happens at the wrong time. And someone realized there is a perfect moment where that penalty means absolutely nothing, right after the finish line. And that realization is where this turns from clever engineering into something much bigger. Because once you understand that timing, you start to see how this wasn't just a trick. It was a weapon, a precise, repeatable advantage used exactly where it hurts rivals the most. And the worst part, it could have stayed hidden all season if one team hadn't started asking questions. But here's where the story takes a turn no one inside the paddock expected. Because once you realize when to trigger that penalty, the entire system flips. Think about it. For an entire lap, the car is managed with absolute precision. Energy deployment, battery usage, every straight, every corner, calculated down to the smallest detail. The goal is simple. Arrive at the final straight with just enough energy left, but not too much. Because too much energy means wasted potential. And too little means the system starts limiting you before the line. But what if that limitation never happens? What if, instead of letting the system slow you down, you shut it off completely? Not gradually, not safely, instantly, right before the finish line. That's exactly what was happening. And the effect is something most fans never see. Because it doesn't look like a boost. It feels like freedom. The car suddenly stops fighting itself. No energy recovery dragging it back. No forced reduction. Just pure combustion power pushing forward without resistance. And in those final meters, that changes everything. Speed stays higher. Acceleration doesn't drop. The stopwatch keeps running in your favor. And by the time anyone notices, it's already too late. The lap is done. The time is locked. The advantage is secured. Then comes the penalty. 60 seconds without the system. Sounds brutal, but it isn't. Because those 60 seconds happen when the driver is already slowing down, cooling the tires, heading back to the pits. So the penalty exists, but it doesn't hurt. It never touches the lap time. It never changes the result. And that's the genius of it. A rule designed to punish, used as part of the strategy. A safety mechanism turned into performance. And the most dangerous part of all, every team had access to the same rules, but not everyone saw the opportunity. Because seeing it requires a different mindset. You don't look at what the rule prevents. You look at when it stops mattering. And once you see that window, you can't unsee it. That's why this wasn't just clever engineering. It was a shift in perspective, a way of thinking that separates good teams from dominant ones. But here's the detail that changes everything. Not all cars benefited equally. Some gained more, some gained less. And that difference starts to reveal who was really ahead, and who was quietly losing ground without even realizing why. And this is where the balance of power quietly shifts. Because on the surface, it looked like a universal trick. Same rule, same opportunity, same potential gain. But Formula One is never that simple. Every engine behaves differently. Every energy system has its own limits. And that tiny detail changes everything. Take Mercedes, for example. Their power unit is known for efficiency. It doesn't drain the battery as aggressively as others, which means when they reach the final straight, they still have energy left. More control, more stability. But here's the twist. Because they arrive with more energy, the natural slowdown is less aggressive. So when they use the trick, the gain is there, but slightly smaller. Still powerful, still decisive, but not at its absolute maximum. Now compare that to another scenario. An engine that burns through energy faster. One that reaches the final straight, almost empty, on the edge, right at the limit where the system would normally start pulling power away, hard. In that situation, the natural slowdown is much stronger, much more punishing. And that means removing it creates an even bigger effect. A bigger jump in speed, a bigger difference on the stopwatch, a bigger advantage when it matters most. And suddenly, what looked like a shared trick becomes an uneven weapon. Some teams were gaining tenths, others were gaining even more, and a few were gaining nothing at all, because they simply couldn't replicate it the same way. And this is where Ferrari enters the story in a completely different role. Not as a user, not as a beneficiary, but as an observer, watching data, studying patterns, comparing telemetry like they always do, lap after lap, sector after sector, until something didn't make sense. Because when they looked at those final meters, the numbers didn't match reality. The expected drop in speed wasn't there. Instead, they saw consistency, even slight increases, exactly where the system should be holding the car back. And that creates a dangerous question. Because in Formula One, when data doesn't match expectations, there are only two possibilities. Either someone has built something extraordinary, or someone has understood the rules better than everyone else. And Ferrari needed to know which one it was. But instead of copying it quietly, instead of trying to reverse engineer it in the shadows, they made a decision that would change everything. They went directly to the FIA, and they asked for clarity. Not an accusation, not a protest, just a question. But in this sport, the right question at the wrong time can be more powerful than any innovation on the grid. And that question forced a chain reaction no one could stop. Because the moment Ferrari contacted the FIA, the situation changed completely. Until that point, this was just a hidden advantage. Quiet, contained, used but not discussed. But once the governing body is involved, silence is no longer an option. Now everything has to be reviewed, analyzed, explained, and more importantly justified. The FIA didn't start by banning anything. They started by looking deep into the data, telemetry traces, energy deployment curves, moments where the system behaved differently than expected. And what they found confirmed the suspicion. The disconnection wasn't random. It wasn't a side effect. It was intentional, precise, timed down to the exact meters before the finish line. And that changes the entire interpretation. Because now it's no longer just about what the rule allows. It's about how it's being used, and whether that use creates a risk. That's the word that matters. Risk. Because once safety enters the conversation, everything accelerates. The FIA doesn't need a rule to be broken. They only need a scenario that could become dangerous. And suddenly, this clever trick starts to look very different. Imagine two cars on track, one following the expected behavior, slowing slightly as the system limits power, and another doing the opposite, maintaining speed, arriving faster than anticipated, closing the gap more quickly than any driver behind expects. That difference, even if small, is unpredictable. And in Formula One, unpredictability is where accidents begin. But that's only part of the problem, because there's something even more subtle, something most people never consider: the data itself. The FIA relies on live telemetry to monitor safety, speed patterns, deceleration, expected behavior, All of it feeds into decisions made in real time. Yellow flags, safety cars, critical reactions in seconds. Now imagine that data suddenly doesn't match reality. A car behaving outside the expected model, not slowing when it should, not following the pattern the system is designed to detect. That creates confusion. And confusion at 300 kilometers per hour is unacceptable. So now the FIA is facing two truths at the same time. The trick is legal, but the consequences are not comfortable. And when those two collide, there is only one direction this can go. Intervention, but not the kind most people expect. No dramatic announcement. No rewritten regulation. No public scandal. Instead, something far more effective. Control. They begin monitoring every single activation, every shutdown, every anomaly. Not just whether it happens, but why it happens. And that one detail destroys the entire advantage. Because before, teams could hide behind the rule. Now they have to explain intent. And intent is impossible to disguise when the data tells the full story. So just like that, the loophole closes. Not with noise, but with precision. And here's where the real consequence begins. Because the moment teams realize they are being watched, they stop. Immediately. No risk. No gray area. No advantage worth a potential penalty that could erase an entire lap. And just like that, something that shaped multiple qualifying sessions disappears overnight. But this is where it gets even more interesting. Because removing an advantage doesn't just slow some teams down. It reveals something much bigger. Who was fast because of innovation, and who was fast because of something no longer there.